the less willing Congress would be to go along on some of these things. The only answer I would offer, and I refer to everybody else here, is sort of congressional inertia. I mean, that once things get built into spending patterns, they stay in spending patterns, and they're difficult to reverse unless there is some significant, person or move or event that causes that to change. So I mean, that's off the top of my head, that's the only thought I have. But I would welcome you all some thoughts on why that is, because it is counterintuitive.
Yeah, I'll just say something quick.
What you all think as well about this. Thank you all for great comments. On this point, I think we worried a lot about, well, what is it? I mean, the sort of core theme of the book is just trying to figure out what is it about war that's generating these effects particularly that we observe in domestic policy. What is it how's it changing our politics? And one story you could tell about war is they boost presidential approval ratings. One story to tell. But I actually don't think it comports with the evidence that we actually find. You don't see a big bump with the outbreak of the Persian Gulf War, right, for congressional acquiescence to the president in domestic policy. When you do observe a big bump in Bush 41's approval ratings, you see a big shift when you transition from war to peace in our data, in congressional voting behavior, and yet that isn't associated with big immediate shifts in presidential approval ratings. So I don't think that's so much the story. Also part of, I mean, so that's one line. What you might say is what's going on with war. Another thing you might point to is this blame avoidance idea that, well, members of Congress are just getting out of the way because they don't want to be fingered for blame when we are at war. If that's true, it seems to me, that then the effects should be greater in foreign policy. You really don't want to get blamed when the president is making decisions that are directly related to the war. And yet what we see are these big effects in domestic policy that are actually greater than those we observe in foreign policy, which is why we're putting our money on it being about the net. We should, when you say war, you want to think about its relevance for presidential power, you should think the nationalization of our politics, right? The extent to which that happens. That provides, I think, some consistent explanation for why we see the effects that we observe and why we can tie together post 9/11 period with World War II, even though on so many dimensions these are radically different military ventures, right? On so many dimensions, but they both have this effect. Why do one thing? I'll just say this one thing, then I'll get out of the way. Looking at trends over the course of a war, we were actually puzzled by this. You'd think that there would be a big bump initially if you don't observe it, and then you'd see it sort of fade out. We simply don't see it in the data. But I think as a matter of principle, that we don't have, if concerns about domestic policy over the course of a war shift to a set of local parochial considerations. If you see that shift, suddenly debates about education policy have to do with, communities and local needs of kids and public versus private, as opposed to how do we keep the country competitive. That's the thing to monitor. When you see that shift to the parochial, from the national to the parochial, that's when presidents are going to have a harder time of it. And we want to argue it has less to do with whether or not the military venture itself is popular or not. That we just don't see evidence for. So, get out of the way.
How are we doing on time here?
Yeah, we can open up for questions now. Are there any have any questions they'd like to ask? Is that Phil?
Hi, yes, Phil Long at Brookings. So I was wondering how you distinguish between Congress accommodating what the president wants and the two things that they want just converging. So how do we know the presidents aren't tucking in their sails on these budget requests over time, as opposed to thinking that Congress is just acquiescing?
That's a great question. So that's something we did look into in the book. And So in addition to kind of bridging the gap between the president's request and the enacted budget, we also estimate the president's request as a function of wartime versus peacetime. We find that actually, if anything, presidents request more money during wartime